Hello everyone, welcome to this video where we're discussing the differences between Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Gaven Kerr today. Welcome, Gavin.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
So I'm sure most people watching this already know who you are. But if there's a few people that don't know who you are, if you want to quickly kind of introduce yourself and what work you're doing.
Yeah, as Joshua says, my name's Gaven Kerr. I'm from Belfast, Northern Ireland. I teach philosophy at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. And I suppose I'm probably known for my work on Aquinas. I published a book, Aquinas' Way to God, in 2015, articulating and defending Aquinas' proof of God from the De Ente et Essentia, chapter 4. And I recently just published a book in just at the end of 2019 there on Aquinas' metaphysics of creation. And other than that, I've published quite a bit on Aquinas' metaphysics, epistemology, Kant, even some stuff on philosophical logic, medieval philosophy, history of philosophy, that sort of stuff. So that's really what I do. I got my doctorate in 2011, and it was on the thought of Aquinas and Kant on epistemic realism. So how mind and world relate to each other. And other than that, I just work away on the history of philosophy, on Aquinas, on metaphysics, all the different branches of philosophy. That's me.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. So I think we'll talk about a bit how this video kind of came about, because originally it was me kind of misinterpreting the first way, basically.
Right? Was it? Okay.
Yeah, it was me taking like a physical interpretation of the first way. So I was kind of reading it as the argument from the physics, basically.
From Aristotle's physics, yeah.
That's right, yeah. And that's actually the first question, first topic we've got to talk about today. So I've just realized that all of my devices are unplugged. So I think I'm just going to leave you to start the conversation while I just get this plugged in, then I'll join back in. So we've got the argument from physics versus the first way.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, just to talk around that issue, and then, we can kind of, sort of come back and bounce ideas off each other. But the argument from Aristotle's physics and Aquinas' first way, Aristotle famously in the physics, he's given an account of mobile being. That's what that's what the physics is about the nature of mobile being. And first of all, he gives an account of motion early on in the physics, and then he articulates the motion principle. Whatever is moved by another. And then he investigates that principle as it's applied to groups or chains of movers, moved movers, as Aristotle calls them. And Aristotle eventually, so he considers, whatever is moved by another, but what about the other which moves? Is that moved by another, and is that moved by another, and so on and so forth. And Aristotle eventually, he argues that such a chain of moved movers has to terminate in some sort of first mover, which is not moved in respect of the movements that it originates. Now, for Aristotle, that first mover is kind of like a mover of the outermost sphere of the heavens. So if you think of the celestial heavens as these different spheres which are all moving, and the lower sphere is moved by the higher, not by the higher, and so on and so on and so on, Aristotle finally comes to some first mover which is unmoved with respect to all the motion within those spheres. Now, importantly, that unmoved mover is not an absolutely unmoved mover, because it can be self-moved. Okay, it's able to be self-moved. It's able, to bring itself into motion. And Thomas points this out in his treatment of these arguments in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, Chapter 13. So Thomas points out there's an issue here, that if we just stick with the argument from the physics, all we have is a first mover which could be moved by itself. It could be self-moved. Well, that's not an unmoved mover, because it is a moved mover, because it moves itself. And now I think about things which move themselves. Agents are the sorts of things that move themselves. They're self-moved movers. Why do agents act? For what reason do agents do something? Well, they see a course of action and they decide to pursue it because they see that course of action as choice-worthy. So there is some cause which motivates that which is self-moved to move. And so the self-moved mover, or, the sort of the first mover that the argument from the physics gets us to, is itself caused in some sort of way, because its motion then is a motion based on some sort of an attraction for some sort of final end, which is why, as St. Thomas points out when he's dealing with this argument in Contra Gentiles chapter 13, that the argument from the physics doesn't get us to God, doesn't get us to an absolutely primary cause or an absolutely unmoved mover. It rather only gets us to a first mover, which can be self-moved, which means that you have to augment it with the argument from the metaphysics. And as Aristotle argues in Metaphysics, book 12, there is some absolutely uncaused cause of all that is, insofar it's the final cause which draws all motion to itself. And in drawing all motion to itself, what it's doing there is it's drawing the self-moved mover of the physics, the first mover of the physics, towards itself, as final cause. And that final cause then is the absolutely unmoved mover of everything. And Thomas is very clear on that in Summa Contra Gentiles chapter 13, that argument just won't work unless it's augmented with the argumentation from the metaphysics. Now, that's kind of, just a general overview of Aristotle's physical argument. It starts with kind of the motions of the heavens, gets to sort of, a first mover of that, and then asks what moves the first mover of that. And then we get into metaphysical argumentation. Now, crucially, Thomas's first way is not that. Okay. Now, if we look at the first way, if we look at the actual text of the first way, Thomas uses a lot of the same terminology. So he says, that it's an argument from motion, not an argument from change. There's been a bit of a discussion going on about this, but Thomas doesn't hold that it's an argument from change, which is mutatio. So that's the Latin word for change, mutatio, because for Thomas, mutatio only applies to things which are generated. This is an argument from motion, which is more general than change. Change can be a form of motion, but motion is more general than change. Now, he affirms, first of all, the motion principle, that whatever is moved by another. And he justifies it, really interestingly, he justifies it by arguing that nothing can be in motion except that it's in potency towards that which is in motion, whereas a thing is moved insofar as it is an act. Motion is the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. So motion is actualized potency. All motion involves actualized potency. So there's a principle of actuality which moves the thing which stands in potency to the motion. So take, for example, something which is actually hot makes it, this is the example from the first way, something which is actually hot makes the wood which is potentially hot to be actually hot, and so moves the thing. Now, interestingly here, Thomas's justification of that motion principle, it's not the same justification that Aristotle gives. Aristotle does talk about act and potency with regard to the motion principle, but he gives lots of other justifications for it as well. And indeed, if you look in the Summa Contra Gentiles, book 1, chapter 13, Thomas gives 3 different arguments for the justification of the motion principle, 2 of which are physical arguments, and only 1 of which is this sort of act potency, the more metaphysical act potency argument. Here in the first way, those 2 physical justifications for the motion principle, which can be found in Aristotle and are in the Contra Gentiles, book 1, chapter 13, they don't appear in the first way. They drop out. All that's left is the metaphysical justification for the motion principle. So Thomas, first of all, he's justifying the motion principle metaphysically and arguing that, all motion requires some principle of actuality to bring something from potentiality to actuality. And then he goes on to argue that, well, first of all, that's a moved mover is something which is both in potentiality and in actuality in some respect. That's what it is to be a moved mover. And then he goes on to argue that there can't be an infinite regress of moved movers based on his reasoning about per se ordered series, which, you know, we'll get into later. He argues that there can't be an infinite regress of moved movers in per se ordered series, in which case we have a primary mover, an unmoved mover, which is the cause of motion for all else. Now, insofar as a moved mover is something which admits of both an admixture of potentiality and actuality, an unmoved mover is something which doesn't admit of both potentiality and actuality. Rather, an unmoved mover, as a mover, has to be actual, and as unmoved can't admit of any potentiality. And then this is going to relate to the per se ordered series stuff again, in which case the unmoved mover is something which is pure actuality. Okay, that's just a bit of a précis of the first way. Now, I've already suggested that this is a metaphysical argument because it's using metaphysical reasoning to, you know, sort of justify the motion principle. But not only that, in the preceding articles of question 2, when Thomas is considering whether or not God's existence can be demonstrated, Thomas argues, look here, we've got a problem. In any demonstrative syllogism, the middle term has to tell us something about the essence of the subject about which we're demonstrating. So, you know, in the typical syllogisms, you've got, you know, a major term, a minor term, and the middle term, which connects the two terms together in the conclusion. Well, look, the middle term has to tell us something about the subject of the conclusion. But the problem with the demonstration of God's existence is that God is the subject of demonstration. And so we can't have an appropriate middle term which tells us something about the essence of God. Before we make the demonstration, we don't even know yet that God exists. So how can we have a demonstration of God's existence? Well, what Thomas does is he makes a distinction which is found in Aristotle's posterior analytics, and which he, you know, affirms, and, you know, he draws out in several other occasions, including his commentary on the posterior analytics. And it's a distinction between demonstrations which are propter quid and demonstrations which are quia. Propter quid demonstrations, they begin from a knowledge of the subject of demonstration, something which is known about the subject of demonstration, form a middle term around that, and then infer something more about that subject. So in the classic Socrates syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. We know something about the essence of Socrates, i.e. that he's a man, and in knowing that, and in also knowing that all men are mortal, we can go on to infer that Socrates himself is mortal. That's a typical propter quid syllogism. But on the other hand, there are what are called quia syllogisms, and these do not begin with a knowledge of the subject of demonstration, of the essence of the subject of demonstration. Rather, these begin with a knowledge of the effect, some sort of, you know, effect of the subject of demonstration, and reason to the subject of demonstration as a cause of that effect. And there's a particular example that Thomas draws out of the posterior analytics about the twinkling of the stars and the twinkling of the planets and their nearness to us. I'm just going to try and run through it in my head. Whatever does not twinkle is near. The planets do not twinkle, therefore the planets are near. So twinkling or lack of twinkling is the middle term here, and that is used to infer the nearness of the planets. We know that the planets are near because, or the Latin term quia, they do not twinkle. So it's some sort of effect or lack thereof pertaining to the planets, i.e. their lack of twinkle, which allows us to infer something about them. And that's how a quia demonstration works. And that's the kind of demonstration that we use for the existence of God. We use some sort of created effect, and from that we're able to infer God's existence. Now, this is why every demonstration for the existence of God, according to Aquinas, has to be metaphysical. If we're going to form a demonstration about God, it has to be a quia demonstration. So it has to reason from some created effect to God as the cause. Now, what sort of created effect can we use to reason to the existence of God? Well, Thomas tells us this in the De Potentia Dei, and later on in the Summa Theologiae, when he takes us through a kind of a history of philosophical reflection on creation. So Thomas, beginning with the pre-Socratics and moving through the history of philosophy, holds that philosophers began to have a sort of a greater and greater awareness of what it is to be created, and in turn what it is for there to be a creator, the closer they got to awareness of the contrast between the being of something and the non-being of something. So the more they became aware of what Thomas calls esse, or the act of existence, and he says this in the De Potentia and in the Summa Theologiae, the more they became aware of the act of existence of the thing, the better understanding they had of creation, until finally, Thomas says, they came to understand the esse, or the act of existence of the thing, and thus were able to consider things in their very being, in contrast to their nothingness. Were they able to understand what it means to be created, and in turn to have a creator, a primary cause of all that is, which, brings things into existence. So it's only whenever philosophers understood the very existence of things, in contrast to their non-existence, were they able to affirm that there is a creator. And in the De Potentia Dei text, Thomas goes on to offer, 3 different demonstrations for God's existence, which he attributes to Plato, Aristotle, and Avicenna, all revolving around this notion of the act of existence. Now, what's important about that? Well, what's important about it is that during those histories of philosophical reflection on creation, he considers some just physical accounts of things, and he holds that considering these physical features of things will not permit you to affirm a creator. They'll only permit you to affirm some sort of cause of the change or motion or whatever of these physical things. It will only allow you to affirm the sort of first cause of motion that Aristotle's physics affirms. Rather, it's only when we consider creatures in their very being are we led to affirm a creator. Only when they come under a consideration, a metaphysical consideration, are we able to affirm a creator. And that's something that Thomas repeats throughout his career. He always argues that God's existence is demonstrated within metaphysics, within first philosophy. And he does that consciously because he reacts to the Averroistic view. The view of Averroes, the Islamic commentator on Aristotle. The Averroists held that God's existence can be demonstrated in physics and then taken on and developed within metaphysics. Whereas Aquinas argues that his general mode of argumentation is that physics only considers mobile being. And so to argue for a primary cause of mobile being is not to argue for a primary cause of being as such. If we want to argue for a primary cause of being as such, we need to consider beings in their very being, which is a metaphysical consideration. So all that, that's the whole context within which any argument for God's existence is forthcoming in St. Thomas's thought. And given that's, material about the demonstrability of God's existence appears just before the 5 ways, and given that this is just Thomas's general views on the demonstration of God's existence, that then means that the demonstrations for God's existence that follow in the 5 ways are metaphysical demonstrations, and indeed that's why we see the defense of the motion principle within the first way as focusing exclusively on act and potency, and how act and potency relate in motion. And the other physical justifications of the motion principle, which you see in Contra Gentiles, chapter 13, and in Aristotle's texts, they don't figure at all in the first way. It's just the metaphysical reasoning which is preserved. So the physical reasoning has been sieved out, and the metaphysical reasoning is kept, which is why the first way is not a physical argument tracing, kind of a line of motions to a first mover, the way the argument from the physics does. Rather, it's a metaphysical argument which considers motion in terms of actualized potency and reasons that there has to be some principle of actuality for the actualized potency that any moved mover has, which leads him then to the affirmation of an unmoved mover, which in terms of the first way is something which is actual insofar as it's a mover, but has no potentiality insofar as it's unmoved. So that's just, kind of in a roundabout way, distinguishing the first way from the argument of the physics. Now, I'm sure, there's more that we can go on to, unpack there, but, if you have any sort of issues you want to, sort of dive into, but that's just as an initial foray. I hope that kind of, gets the ball rolling.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. There was a lot covered there. which was excellent. Two things just came to mind as you were speaking about that. Two things that Aquinas held. One was that action follows being, and how we might relate that to the differences between the physical and metaphysical argument. And then the principle of proportionate causality.
Right.
In reference to your two different kinds of reasoning, that we reason from the effect to the cause, because what's in the effect must in some way be in the cause.
Right.
So which one of those, would you like to just briefly talk about both of those? So maybe start with the action follows being.
So this idea that action follows being in Latin, agere sequitur esse. So the idea here is that something cannot act, and the sort of action we're talking about is not to be in act, to be actual. Okay, because to be actual just means to be, means to have esse. We're talking about acting, doing something. So the idea here is that one cannot act, one cannot do something unless one actually exists. And the kind of action in which one can engage is an action that follows one's being. And the interesting way in which, Thomas deploys this in his thinking, and it actually had a huge influence on my doctoral work when it came to epistemic realism, is that the being of the thing, a thing's esse, is limited to the essence of the thing whose esse, whose existence it is. So my active existence is limited to my essence, which is a human essence, which is this rational animality, which is right here. My dog's active existence is limited to my dog's essence, which is, a Beagle German Shepherd cross, that sort of thing. And so the only way in which I can, act is as a rational animal. And, obviously as a rational animal, I can emulate the actions of, other things. And that's just part and parcel of what it is to be a rational animal. So I can't fly like a bird, but I can certainly, as a rational animal, invent some sort of contraption which will allow me to simulate flight. That's the idea. But I can only do that as a rational animal. That's the only kind of activity in which I can engage. And so the same for, any other existing thing, it can only engage in the kind of activity which is proper to it as the kind of thing that it is, because its activity follows its actual being. That has implications for ethics. It also has implications for God's omnipotence, because what sort of things can God do? Well, if God is pure existence itself, then God can bring about any possibility of existence. So, I mean, that's an issue, we can get into that, with regard to omnipotence. One of the things which interested me, when I was writing my doctorate, is that if the activity of the thing, the action of a thing, is a kind of a manifestation of the being of the thing, and the being of the thing is limited to the essence of the thing, whose being it is, then the activity of a thing on me as an epistemic subject is disclosive or revelatory of the being and thereby the essence of the thing which is present to me in an epistemic context. In other words, the thing in reality is available there to be known by me in an epistemic context. And so that was one of the arguments that I pursued in defense of epistemic realism against Kantian idealism in my doctorate. So that's kind of where I got interested in that. Is there anything, before we get on to proportionate causality, is there anything you want to kind of pursue or follow up with on that?
I was just thinking if we could directly apply that, maybe in a slightly different way to the first way, maybe changing it to something like local motion follows being, because then we'd be saying if we do take a physical argument and talk about, it's all well and good to say about how these things are causing each other, but they wouldn't cause each other unless they first existed, in which case we then have to move from the physical to the metaphysical, if that makes sense.
That's certainly true, and we can affirm that, but I don't think that's what's going on in the first way. I've got a vague recollection that some authors argue that you've got motion, and we're looking at all this motion which is going on, and then we ask, well, what is it behind the motion that makes the motion possible? Well, the things have to exist in order for the motion to be. So we have to get to the active existence of the motion, and then we have to get to a primary active existence of the motion. I don't think that's what's going on in the first way, and I don't see the first way as affirming that. The first way simply springboards from motion and asks, well, look, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. And then it says, well, why is that the case? Well, because, of the actuality and potentiality, that, something which is in motion is a mixture of act and potency, actualized potency. So we need a principle of actuality, which actualizes that potency. So immediately he's diving straight into the fact that for any actualized potency, you need a principle of actuality for it. Now, I do think that bears an existential interpretation, insofar as the principle of actuality for any actualized potency will have to presuppose existence. And so, the activity by which, any potentiality is actualized will be an activity of, something which has esse. And I do think, that is the general metaphysical context of the first way. But you can set that aside and just say, well, look, this is a metaphysical argument, which is focusing on act and potency and arguing that there has to be some principle of actuality for any actualized potency. And I think that's closer to the reading of the actual text as we have it.
Yeah.
So
thank you for that.
So I guess that principle that, a Jerry sequitur esse, or act follows being. In a general, if you were doing a sort of general metaphysical context out of which this emerges, in other words, if you were kind of trying to bring together all the different strands of Thomist metaphysics, which is the backdrop against which you could read the first way, then that would have its place. But if you just want to read the first way as the metaphysical argument that it is, then I don't even think that you need to do that. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay.
So what would it be right to say that people like John Whipple perhaps would give that kind of plain reading interpretation that you would lean more towards, rather than confusing it with too many added things that aren't completely necessary?
Yeah, well, I mean, personally, I do go for the existential reading of the first way. Now that I've never published on that yet. Okay, so that's always the thing. I've never published on that, but personally, I do go for the existential reason. But insofar as I've never published on it, I haven't kind of really, been too outspoken on that, which is why I'm just sort of saying that just the plain metaphysical reading, of which the existential reading is a species. The metaphysical reading is the well-established reading of the first way, precisely because Thomas, is avoiding that Averroistic physical kind of argumentation. And I think a representative of just a plain metaphysical reading, as opposed to the stronger existentialist reading, would be somebody like John Whipple. So as the last time I read Whipple in the metaphysical thought, he is very historically wedded to the text. He does not want to go beyond the text one bit. And I think, he does consider, some of the positions. The last time I read him, which was a while back, he does consider some of those more existential interpretations, to which he's very sympathetic. He does have a good feeling for the existentialist approach. But as I remember, he says that, whilst it is a metaphysical argument, it starts from some physical reality, but quickly gets to the metaphysics. The stronger, existential readings of the first, and I think also the second way, he says as well, would be going beyond the text of St. Thomas. Now, I haven't published in that yet, so I mean, I kind of disagree with him slightly there. I think we do have, wiggle room to affirm the existential reading, but in any case, Whipple would just be the man just for the plain metaphysical reading of the text, and that would just be a safe reading of the text, because Thomas is clear that it's metaphysics that establishes God, not physics. So how's that?
Yeah, I've got many books on my list to buy, and his is definitely one of them.
Oh yeah, it's a classic. It's 20 years old now, but I don't think it's aged. It still is, a great book to read on Thomist metaphysics. And after that was published, anything came out after it followed it, and it had to take that seriously. Like the work of Joseph Owens, say, on the first way, or Gilson and Owens and those neo-Thomists on the existentialist approach. Any work after them had to build on their work, and it's the same with Whipple on Aquinas' metaphysics. Anything after has to build on Whipple. You know, you can't overlook it. Yeah. So it's good that you're looking to pick that up. It's a great book.
Yeah. So just the other thing that we could briefly discuss was the principle of proportionate causality.
Yeah, I've seen, you know, people talk about the principle of proportionate causality, and you know, I suppose the general idea, you know, behind it, that a thing cannot give what it does not have. When properly understood, that's fine. But I've never seen it. How would I put it? I've never seen it just blatantly affirmed in Aquinas' thought, the principle of proportionate causality, other than the affirmation that for a cause to be a cause, it has to have some degree of actuality, and the effect stands in potency to the cause with respect to the actuality that the cause has. So, and that's what's involved in a causal relationship, that the effect stands in potency to some actuality that the cause has. So the cause is able to grant actuality to the effect. As far as I can see, that's as much as Thomas is going to give you there. Whereas I think proponents of the principle of proportionate causality, they want something a lot stronger. They want to hold that there is some proportionality between the cause and its effect, such that the reality that the effect has is contained in the cause, you know, virtually, eminently, or, you know, however they want to, you know, describe it. But in any case, it's not really a principle I feel that we need to be strongly committed to in defending, you know, Aquinas' proofs of God's existence. We do need to be committed to the causal principle, understood in terms of act and potency, as Thomas understands it. But beyond that, I don't think we need to be committed to anything stronger than that. How does that sit with you?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. So just one last point to make on this kind of physical versus metaphysical interpretation. It's just a wording that some people use to describe the per se causal series as a hierarchically ordered series.
Oh, yeah,
So just to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Okay, so very, very little work has been done just on these sorts of series in and of themselves. Now, I mean, they do appear in the demonstrations for God's existence in Aquinas, in Scotus, and in Occam, you know. So they were well-known, you know, series in medieval metaphysics. And they were known as, Thomas uses the language of per se ordered series. Scotus uses the language of essentially ordered series. The terminology, you know, it doesn't really sort of matter. But Scotus is the one that sets down a set of conditions for what these series must look like. And this is in his commentary on the sentences, his ordained commentary on the book of the sentences. So his ordained commentary is the one that he, you know, thought, you know, should be published, that he looked over and decided should be published, known as the Ordinatio, but it's his commentary on the sentences. And in this, when he's distinguishing essentially ordered from accidentally ordered series, he holds that in essentially ordered series, posterior causes depend on primary causes for their causality. Posterior causes are less perfect than prior causes, and the causes in the series, causes and effects in the series, they act simultaneously so as to produce the ultimate effect. So Scotus thinks there has to be these three features. And definitely, if they are the three features of essentially ordered series, then it seems that hierarchy is essential to such series, that you can't construe them in any other way except as hierarchical. But to my knowledge, Thomas, he's not as committed as Scotus is in this respect. At most, I think you can say for Thomas, is that the members of per se ordered series are dependent for their causality on some primary cause. And the primary cause is primary precisely because it's not dependent for its causality. It has its causality per se. And so this captures Thomas's, you know, sort of statements that what is through another, what is per aliud, is reduced to what is per se. What exists through participation, per participationem, is reduced to, what exists per se. And also in the examples that Thomas uses, that the mind or the mental agent moves the hand to move the stick to move the stone, which, if I'm right in thinking, is the example that he uses in the first way. I'm just having a look at the first way. Quick run through it. That which is put in motion be put in motion and also need put in another, but this cannot go to infinity. There'd be no first and consequently no other moving, seeing subsequent movers move only in as much as put in motion as the staff moves only because put in motion by the hand. Okay, so the hand, stick, stone, that general example, you get the staff moved by the hand here in the first way, and in the more general sense, you get it later in the Summa in around questions 40. He gives a more expanded version of that per se ordered series. The idea of it there is that the secondary causes or the secondary movers in the series don't possess the causality of the series in themselves. So motion in this case, or the actuality signified by motion, in this case, the actualization of their potential, they don't possess in virtue of themselves. So the hand, stick, and the stone, they don't possess that actuality of motion in virtue of being hands, sticks, and stones, but they're dependent on that which is primary, which is the mind, which does have the actuality of motion in and of itself, i.e., that's something that mental agents can do. They can, bring things into motion just because, they're mental agents. It seems to me essential then to Aquinas' account of per se ordered series is that the causality of the series is not possessed by the members essentially, whereas they are dependent on some primary cause which is per se, or which has the causality of the series per se. Now, that doesn't commit us to hierarchy. Okay. I mean, the mind moves the hand to move the stick to move the stone. Would you call that a hierarchy? I'm not sure whether or not you could call it a hierarchy. I mean, you certainly couldn't call the hierarchy in the way that Scotus thinks, that, the posterior are less perfect than the prior. How is the stone, the stick, and the hand, how are they all less perfect than what? So how is the stone less perfect than the stick, and the stick less perfect than the hand? Sure, I mean, it is the case that the hand, the stick, and the stone are less perfect with regard to the mind or the mental agent, because they are the instruments of the mental agent and they don't have the causality per se. But then the hierarchy, that sort of hierarchy only comes as a result of the fact that the members of the series don't possess the causality per se and are reducible to what does possesses the causality per se. So hierarchy only comes about as an emergent feature of per se ordered series conceived in that more fundamental way about, possessing causality essentially and non-essentially. So hierarchy isn't essential to the characterization of the series there. It only comes about as a result of that more fundamental characterization of the series. So it doesn't seem to me at all clear that for Thomas, per se ordered series are essentially characterized as hierarchical series. I think that's something that Scotus is committed to. And, since Scotus, is really explicit in his, articulating the nature of these series, perhaps that's, one of the reasons why, this has sort of come down to us. And also, philosophers, being inventive, inspired by these thinkers, given their own accounts of how these series are to be construed. But I don't see that these series can be construed as essentially hierarchical in St. Thomas's thinking on the matter. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. It just led me to think of another point as well that I've seen you talk about before, regarding per se series, but I think it might be linked more to the Diente proof, which is this idea of the actualization is concurrent.
Yeah.
Whether it's a premise or whether it's whether we arrive at that conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So if you just very briefly like to talk about the differences there about whether this concurrent actualization is used as a premise or arrived at through the proof.
Yeah, I mean, concurrence is definitely not something that Thomas, presupposes for these series. And in fact, it's something that Scotus holds is necessary for the series, because Scotus, remember, the three features of per se ordered series is that the posterior depend on the primary for their causality. Right, well, yes, Thomas affirms that, okay? posterior are less perfect than the prior. Well, I mean, the hand stick and the stone are certainly less perfect than the mental agent, but the stone isn't less perfect than the stick, or the stick less perfect than the hand. Okay, so I mean, Thomas doesn't exactly affirm that. But then the third one is that the causes in the series act simultaneously to produce the final effect. So you have to have the primary cause acting simultaneously with all the secondary causes, all acting simultaneously to produce the final effect. So there needs to be concurrence there. So concurrence is built into the series. And interestingly, William of Ockham criticized Scotus for this, because he said, if that's the case, then it's not going to do just thinking of any sort of, efficient cause, within the series. Efficient cause, one efficient cause can produce one effect, and then that can produce another effect, and that can produce another effect, and so on and so forth in an inertial fashion. You can have succession where, one drops out and the other comes in. Occam argues against Scotus that the only way that you can get, some sort of, primary cause out of these per se ordered series is if that the causes so considered are conserving causes, because the first has to conserve the second conserves the third, and the third conserves the fourth, and so on and so on. So as long as these causes are conserving, then you have simultaneity, and then you have per se ordered series. But for Thomas, nothing about that. In Thomas's account, concurrence isn't a feature, it isn't an intrinsic feature of per se ordered series as Thomas articulates it, because from all I've seen in St. Thomas, per se ordered series are articulated in terms of the members not possessing the causality of the series in virtue of what they are, and thereby being reducible or dependent on something which does possess the causality of the series in virtue of what it is. Now, there could be concurrence there, but that's going to require further argument. We need to consider what kind of causality it is within the series, and ask whether or not on the basis of that kind of causality, is there concurrence? Is the primary cause also a sustaining or conserving cause? Okay, so that's not guaranteed unless we consider the particular type of causality. Now, for Thomas, when the causality is the act of existence, or esse, well then, the primary cause does have to be a sustaining cause, and that's precisely anything other than the primary cause of esse is nothing unless it participates in the causality that it receives from this primary cause. Should it cease to participate in that causality at any point, it would cease to be. How do these secondary, causes, or these secondary members of per se ordered series participate in the primary cause of esse? By having their esse caused. Okay, and by having their esse, and that's just what it means to have their esse caused, is to participate in the esse that's granted to them by the primary cause. Such esse doesn't sort of, just become a part of the thing which exists. The thing which exists is, Thomas uses the example of the atmosphere being illuminated. It's illuminated. The thing which exists is illuminated with existence, or with esse, by the primary cause. So that should it cease to stand in that relationship, should it cease to stand in that causal relationship to the primary cause, it would cease to be. Which is why then a primary cause of esse just is a conserving cause. But conservation isn't built in to his account of per se ordered series. It's not a premise in the argument for God's existence.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm actually yet to read your papers on accidentally and per se ordered series. Can listeners find those anywhere? Are they available online?
Yes, they're so the first one that came out, when did it come out? I think it was around 2012. And it was essentially ordered series reconsidered. And the funny story about how it came to be written, I had to teach this stuff it was actually a group of seminarians, so guys trained for the priesthood. And I knew how I wanted to, articulate it and stuff, but I just couldn't think of a model for articulating it. And I got up to the whiteboard, and you start writing things on the whiteboard, and then all of a sudden the model came to me for articulating it. And out of that lesson and the students' questions after that grew that paper, essentially ordered series reconsidered. And I think at the end of that paper, I thanked the students, for their engagement with me in that. So that was essentially ordered series reconsidered. That was published in the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly. and I think it was around about 2012. And that considered efficient causality, primary cause in terms of a primary efficient cause. Mind moves the hand to move the stick to move the stone. I followed that up with a paper. I think the paper came out in 2017. I wrote it early 2016, and it takes a while for these papers to come out. But I think it came out in 2017, where I again considered essentially ordered series, but this time with regard to final causality. So with regard to the final cause, so the sort of cause which motivates the causality of the efficient cause. And I ran the argument the same way, but just in the opposite direction. So just as in per se ordered series, you need a primary cause which possesses per se the causality of the series, so too do you need a final cause which possesses per se the final causality of the series, so that not only is there an absolute primary cause, there's also an absolute final cause, or a primary final cause. The absolute primary cause is SA, or pure SA itself. The absolute final cause is the good itself. And the really interesting thing there is that insofar as the primary cause is pure SA itself, and yet it's motivated, by, this final cause, which is the good itself, but there's nothing outside of pure SA itself to which it can stand in potency, to which it stands as subject. Pure SA itself is the good itself. So the primary efficient cause is also the primary final cause. The one that so everything originates from it, and everything strives to return to it. It might be related to, sort of, I think there was a question about human destiny or something in St. Thomas is coming up.
Natural desire for God.
Yeah, there you go. So it relates to that.
Yeah, that was brilliantly put. Yeah, that everything comes from SA and everything wants to return. Yeah,
strives to return to it. Yeah.
So that just about wraps up the first question, which was we always knew this one was going to be the longest one, I think.
There's plenty more to discuss on that. Those differences between Aristotle and Aquinas, and But
is there any final thoughts that you have just on the physical and metaphysical interpretations, just to kind of finish that question off?
Not really. Just I forgot to mention. So you asked where people could get reading some of those articles on per se ordered series. The first article was called Essentially Ordered Series Reconsidered. The second article was considered Essentially Ordered Series Reconsidered once again. So we had efficient causality, we have final causality. Now there's a gap. I haven't yet integrated formal and material causality into per se ordered series. Literally today, I was, working on an article that I'm, bringing to completion on that. So I got about 5,000 words written today on that. So tentative title is, what was the tentative title? Essentially Ordered Series, Completely Considered.
Yes.
That's the tentative title. Anyway, sorry, that's just an aside. But yeah, any final thoughts on, Aristotle, Aquinas, those different arguments? I suppose it's just to stress that often Aquinas' thought, and this is true for a lot of the medievals, but often Aquinas' thought is taking to be a kind of a sophisticated representation of Aristotle's thought, which the more research which has gone into Aquinas' thinking, especially in the 20th century and the other medievals as well, the more research which has gone into his thinking, the more we see that Aquinas was an original thinker and can't be blanketly identified as an Aristotelian if Platonists, especially when it comes to his own original thought. Whilst he was impressed by Aristotle and Aristotle's account of things, especially in metaphysics, and especially when it comes to the philosophical knowledge of God, he was highly aware of the Neoplatonic views, and he was keen to integrate Neoplatonic thinking into his views of the matter. And this especially, as he got older and, he got more and more familiar with the Neoplatonic tradition. The Neoplatonic tradition was always there, but as he got more and more familiar with it, it became more and more integrated into his thinking. And indeed, in his commentary on the divine names of Pseudo-Dionysius, he states in the introduction that the Platonists might have got things wrong with regard to the separate ideas, the separate ideas which exist independently of things. But when it comes to their views about God, they've got things right. Okay, we're in agreement with them there. So he does single out the Platonists for high praise, and not only that, one of the reasons why Aquinas is such an original thinker and is not, constrained to the thinking of Aristotle is because, well, look, there was, over a millennium of, philosophical reflection, not only, sort of an Aristotle's thinking and Plato's thinking, but just the original thinking in and of itself. So he's influenced by, the Islamic philosophers here, Avicenna and Averroes. As I point out, he disagrees with the Averroistic view that, God's existence established in physics. He's much more Avicennian in that account. It's metaphysics, which establishes the existence of God. And also, God forbid, Aquinas is just an original thinker who, can develop his own arguments and, come up with his own ideas. I mean, people have no problem, holding that Kant was an original thinker, Descartes, Hume, original thinkers. Why can't Aquinas have been an original thinker as well? Certainly uses an Aristotelian terminology at times, and for those outside looking in the use of the Aristotelian terminology may indicate that what he's thinking is Aristotelianism. But for those of us who know Aquinas' thought, we can demarcate where he diverges from Aristotle, where he kind of introduces his own thinking, which is consistent with Aristotle's, but takes it in a direction that Aristotle wouldn't have recognized. And also, Aquinas always has this deference to authority, not just because it's authority, but because he realizes that these, sort of the mighty dead, the great thinkers, are the mighty dead for a reason. That there was something about their thinking that is worth taking seriously. So he is keen to try and preserve anything that their thought that he can salvage. That's not just the case with Aristotle; it's also the case with Plato as well. When he's commenting on Aristotle's metaphysics, whilst he agrees with Aristotle's criticism of Plato's theory of forms, he always strives to defend Plato against Aristotle's criticisms of participation. Even in such a way that he defends Plato in such a way that Plato probably wouldn't even have recognized, because Plato, didn't give, these justifications for his positions. Yet Aquinas, seems to come across as, the better Platonist in this respect with regard to participation than Plato himself was. And that's because he does have this respect for them as, these mighty thinkers. And so he does seek to give them as charitable a reading as possible. And all that goes together. It can lead one to think that Aquinas is just, saying the first way, rehashing the argument from the physics. But for those who, sort of understand Aquinas' approach to God, and Aquinas' wider views on metaphysics and philosophical demonstration, that's just not a defensible position. Not only that, when you read the actual argument of the first way and you go back and read Aristotle's argument of the physics, I mean, they're nowhere near like other than just the general framework and the principle, like whatever is moved by another. Other than that, they're just not the same argument. So I suppose that's a bit sprawling, sort of sort of final thoughts on that. My advice would just be to just read what St. Thomas says. Take him at his word for what he's saying, and not try to read into him something that you would like him to be saying, or that you think he might be saying because Aristotle said it. Read St. Thomas and read St. Thomas as the interpreter of St. Thomas. So how's that for a final thought there?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. And we'll be getting on to participation later on as well in Plato. Next up, we've got the Unmoved Mover versus Actus Purus. So this is basically what Aristotle meant when he spoke of God compared to what Aquinas means when he speaks of God.
Yeah, so we kind of got to that, didn't we? in contrasting the physical, Aristotle's argument from physics with Aquinas' first way. So Aristotle's argument from physics is tracing a series of motions to a first mover. And this first mover is unmoved with respect to the motions, of the heavens. It's like, it's the outermost, it's what moves the outermost sphere, and then that sphere moves all the further spheres until we get down, to everyday sort of local motion that we see. So it's just wider and wider scales of motion until we get to the mover of the outermost sphere. But that mover could be a self mover, in which case it's not absolutely unmoved. It's unmoved with respect to the motion of the spheres, but in itself it's not absolutely unmoved. In which case its movement has to be explained. Why does it move itself? And that's where you get the argument, from the metaphysics. There is some final cause which motivates the motion even of that first mover of the spheres, and that's, sort of the absolutely unmoved mover. In Aquinas, in the first way, what's under consideration, so he says that the first way is taken from motion, or taken on the side of motion. And he immediately introduces the motion principle. Whatever's put in motion is put in motion by another. And he justifies that with his account of act and potency, that, motion is actualized potency, so that for any motion there has to be a principle of actuality, and what accounts for that principle of actuality, which is it's ultimately some unmoved mover, which is a mover insofar as it grants actuality, but it's unmoved insofar as it doesn't have its actuality granted. So if it doesn't have its actuality granted, it has no potency. Okay, so if it stands subject to nothing, or in potency to nothing, to have its actuality granted, yet it grants the actuality of everything else. It is in act, but it has no potency. So it's not any sort of actualized potency or fully actualized potency or anything like that. It just is pure act itself.
Yeah, brilliant. And then if we were to go a bit further now and then see how this relates to the divine attributes.
Yeah.
And then we can also distinguish there between what Aquinas thought of God and what Aristotle thought of God or gods. And the attributes that they had.
Yeah. Okay. So, immediately after that, immediately after Thomas establishes the existence of God in the five ways, I take it we're thinking about the Summa Theologiae here, or just in general?
In general, I think. Yeah, we'll keep it general.
Okay. Well, we've kind of springboarded, so from the first way, pure actuality. But all of the five ways, get us to more or less the same point, that we arrive at some sort of primary cause of all that is, without which there is nothing, which all understand God to be, or which all understand, or which all call God. Why does he say that? Well, if you look at the sed contra to the article on the five ways, it identifies God as I am who am. He says, this is what we're arguing towards. This is what the conclusion of each of the ways is trying to get at. I am who am. That which exists in virtue of what it is. So every one of the five ways is seeking to show that this primary cause is I am who am. Okay, that which exists in virtue of what it is. And incidentally, that's why I disagree with Whipple. I think there's a wee bit more wiggle room here, that it's not just a general sort of metaphysical approach, that each of the five ways, it can be given an existential articulation, because in the sed contra, God is defined as he who is, and each of the five ways then seeks to arrive at God as he who is, so that the primary cause then is the primary cause of the existence of all things. That's a hermeneutical issue, but I think that is an important hermeneutical key. As I say, I haven't published on that yet, but I'll let you make any inferences, from that sort of wee yet that I said there. In any case, Aquinas accepts that he has established that there is some primary cause which is pure actuality in and of itself. In a more sort of general sense, this cause which is pure actuality is pure existence itself, because esse, existence, is the act of all acts. Okay, to say something is pure actuality in Aquinas' thought is to say that it's pure existence. That's the more existential interpretation of Aquinas' metaphysics, and it's the more existential gloss of the five ways there. Now, how do we get on then to the divine attributes, what God is like? Well, Aquinas' general approach, not just in the Summa Theologiae, but elsewhere, is that, look, given that, this is what the primary cause is, pure actuality. Well, what would it be like to be pure actuality? Okay, so we still don't have a direct insight into God's essence. We can't know the essence of God. So Thomas can't say, well, let's just, have a look at what God is and, figure that out for ourselves. We can't perceive God's essence. So he considers, well, given that it's pure actuality, pure esse itself, what would God be like? What can we say about God? And the first thing that he says we can say about God is that God is utterly simple. Why? Because anything which is composite has to have some sort of element of potentiality. And if it exists, that potentiality is actualized. And the most basic form of composition is the composition of essence and existence. And then all other forms of composition follow on from that. So there has to be an existing thing in order for there to be other forms of composition, such as matter and form, substance and accident, supposite and nature, and so on. But insofar as God, as pure actuality, pure esse itself, doesn't have any potentiality, God's not composite in any way. So God is simple. And not only that, God is utterly unique, because in God, there's no distinction between the individual that God is and the nature that God has. Because in order for there to be such distinction in composition, God would have to be in potency in some way. The individual would have to stand in potency to the nature that he is. So we as individuals stand in potency to rational animality as our natures, and the nature would have to stand in potency to the individual in order to instantiate it. So for anything in which the individual and the nature are distinct, there has to be some sort of potentiality, but there is no potency in God, because God is pure actuality, pure esse, in which case there is no division between individual and nature. Why is that important? It's important because God isn't an instance of some sort of nature, such as divinity or deitas, in the way that we're instances of humanity. So God is single, not in the way in which the last man on earth would be single, because there could be more men. The only reason why there could be more men is because there's a distinction between the individual and the species or the nature that the individual instantiates. There could be other things to instantiate that nature. Because there isn't such a distinction in God, there's no nature which God instantiates. So God then, as the individual that he is utterly unique. He is individual precisely because there is nothing that could be like God except being like God. Whereas there is nothing that could be like God except being God. Whereas we are individual, the individuals that we are, because we're individuated in some sort of way. Whereas God himself is not individuated. There is no principle of individuation which has individuated him. He simply is. He simply is who he is, and nothing else could be like him. And that's what serves to, isolate him as the individual that he is. So God is simple, utterly unique. And then in a similar sort of fashion, Thomas derives all the different divine attributes, omnipotence, omniscience, and so forth. They're all derived on the basis of considering God as pure actuality, pure esse itself.
Yeah, so if we kind of flip that and try to apply that, well, I don't think we'll be able to, but if we were to try and apply that to the unmoved mover of the physics argument, what kind of problems would we run into there? I assume the main one would obviously be that it still has to be an admixture of actuality and potentiality.
Yeah. So the first mover of the physics will still admit of some element of potency because it's self-moved. Okay. So there is going to be some sort of composition, even if it's just the composition that it's lacking the motive force to move itself, which is why you need the argument from the metaphysics. So it's not going to be absolutely simple. It's not going to be the cause of all that is, because it itself is caused as well. Not only that, the sort of first mover of the physics isn't the cause of the existence of things. The existence of things is presupposed. It's just the source of their motion. So there are key differences there. Now, we could augment the argument from the physics with the argument from the metaphysics, and we get to an absolutely unmoved mover, which Aristotle identifies as thought, thinking itself. And that, introduces kind of a bit of a difference, because now we have, something absolute, self-contained, which draws the motion of all things to itself as the absolute final cause. So it draws the motion of the first mover from the physics, which motion moves all the heavens and all the different spheres. So it's all like one big, sort of, dynamo all being sort of drawn towards this, absolutely unmoved mover, which is self-thinking thought. The key difference there between Aristotle's thought and St. Thomas's is that, Aristotle's self-thinking thought thinking self, grand and all the rest. But for Thomas, insofar as pure existence itself, pure actuality, is the good itself towards which all things strive, it has a care for creatures. It brings creatures into existence, not because it has to, because, as we say, God doesn't have a nature by which he is necessitated. So even though God is the good itself, which he is in virtue of being pure esse itself, he's not necessitated to create on the basis of his nature, because he could just go on being the good itself without creating, without bringing things into existence. So that then means that if he brings anything into existence, he does so because he wants to, not because he has to, because he wants to. And so in willing things into existence, he wills things into existence so that they may enjoy the good that he is, so that they may come to enjoy him as the good itself. Nothing like that in Aristotle's thought. Self-thinking thought isn't interested in creatures, had no interest in creatures whatsoever. Whereas here, you have God does have an interest in creatures, and that's precisely why he creates them. So creation is an act of love by which, God wants, what is good for creatures, and in order for creatures to enjoy the good that he is, he gives them existence so that they may enjoy it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. So we're going to kind of change the subject a bit now.
Okay.
Away from God to the immortality of the soul.
Okay, nice.
Okay, so if you want to kind of just quickly explain what the soul is, first of all, and then what Aristotle and Aquinas disagreed on or agreed on in regards to its immateriality and its immortality.
Yeah. Well, so here you get you don't get as definite a division between Aquinas and Aristotle. You do when it comes to God, and you do when it comes to issues in metaphysics pertaining to act and potency and the act of existence. And that's because Aquinas' thinking on the act of existence comes from the more Neoplatonic sort of thinking. The Neoplatonists held that whilst form is a principle of actuality, there is some reality beyond form to which form is subject, to which even form stands in potency. So for Plotinus, for instance, that's the one. Forms are subsequent to the one, and so there's some supraformal principle to which even form is subject. And you get that strand of thinking in Aquinas. So whilst Aquinas is an Aristotelian when it comes to matter and form, yes, that's fine, so matter stands to form as potency to act. Thomas is more Neoplatonic when it comes to the act of existence, because there's something beyond form to which even form stands as subject, which, no pure-blooded Aristotelian would hold. So when it comes to those aspects of his metaphysical thinking, there is definitely a divergence between Aquinas and Aristotle. And insofar as Thomas builds his whole philosophy of God out of his, own unique thinking on the act of existence, the differences between Aquinas and Aristotle become very striking. There is a definite divergence there. Now, Thomas is also saying, well, look, this is what Aristotle really meant, but, he didn't. Okay. Historically speaking, he just didn't. Okay. But now when it comes to the soul, when it comes to body and soul, there is a greater convergence here. Because when when it comes to soul and body, that's tied in with Aristotle's thinking just on matter and form as components of a composite substance. That's not to do with any sort of super formal principle of things, but it's to do just with how matter and form are composed themselves. Now, there is a twist when it comes. Aquinas' philosophy of existence does come in here a bit, and we'll kind of get to that with the immortality of the soul business. But just to explain what body and soul are, Aristotle held that there is an exhaustive division of substances between living substances and non-living substances. So a substance is either alive or it's not alive. Now, both living and non-living substances are material substances. Okay, they're material things. And given that they both share their matter in common, it cannot be matter which distinguishes the living from non-living things. So what distinguishes them? Well, it's the form that the matter takes. Living things have a peculiar kind of form which non-living things don't have. And Aristotle called this souche, or anima. Hence, animate as opposed to inanimate, those without anima and those with anima. And that's come to be translated as soul. So the soul is the form of the body, okay? And it's that by which the living thing is alive. It's the primary principle of life, not a secondary principle of life, because, the heart, the lungs, nervous system, brain, they're all secondary principles of life. This is the primary principle of life, without which not even the secondary principles would be principles of life. Okay, so the soul is the form of the body, and there are three different grades of soul. There's the very lowest kind of life, the very lowest kind of life, which is just nutritive life, things which can take in, living things which take in nutrition and nothing else. Then the stage beyond that are living things which take in nutrition, but also engage sensorially in an environment around, in their environment in which they live. So they can move about in an environment, engage, have sensory experience, and, they engage in nutrition and all that. So they do everything that things with a nutritive soul do and more. Okay, so they have, more operations, more powers, and this is because they have a sensitive soul. Okay, so whereas those with only a nutritive soul can only take in nutrition, things with a sensitive soul can not only take in nutrition in virtue of their sensitive soul, but also engage in sensory activity in their environment. And then the next stage after that are those things with a rational soul, which not only can engage in nutrition, engage in sensory sort of movements in their environment, but they can also know the truth about things, the truth about God, and engage in interpersonal relationships. And human beings have a rational soul. Okay. Now, the rational soul has two operations which are not dependent on any material organ. The understanding of things and the willing of things. The understanding of things doesn't depend on a material organ. It's a power of the rational soul not dependent on the material organ, insofar as in order to understand, the rational soul has to stand in potency to all things that are intelligible. Okay? It doesn't possess the actuality of any of those things, otherwise the rational soul wouldn't stand in potency to understanding those things. Okay? So if it possesses the actuality of anything which is intelligible, okay, it can't stand in potency to it, and so it can't be said to be able to understand it because it would have the actuality of it. That being the case, it can't have the actuality, the power of understanding can't have the actuality of matter, because our understanding capacities, that power of the rational soul that we have, stands in potency to understanding the natures of material things. So if it has the actuality of any material thing, then it can't be said to understand that thing. Okay. So the rational soul then can't be said in its act of understanding to have the actuality of any material organ, in which case it's not dependent on a material organ for that power. Similar reasons go then, for its willing of the good, because the willing of the good is basically the intellectual appetite for the good, which intellectual appetite is derived from the power to understand of the rational soul. So insofar as the rational soul has these two powers which don't depend on a material organ, these are immaterial powers of the rational soul. And insofar as the rational soul, insofar as these are powers of the rational soul itself cannot be material. Okay. Now, that doesn't make the rational soul a substance. It's not a Cartesian mind or anything like that. It's not a substance. It's the form of the body, yet it's an immaterial form. Okay, so it's an immaterial form of the body. Insofar as it's an immaterial form, its identity conditions are not the identity conditions of matter. It's not identified with matter. So the identity conditions of the soul are not the identity conditions of the body, whose soul it is, so that when the body dissolves and decomposes and rots away, that doesn't mean that the soul will decompose and rot away. Because insofar as it has distinct identity conditions, it has distinct persistence conditions. What it is for the soul to persist is not the same as what it is for the body to persist. And this is because the active existence which any substance has, it has through its form. Okay? This is actually something that I was writing about today in that article it says that I was writing. Thomas, he repeats, in his thinking that forma dat esse, that form gives esse to the thing. Now, what does he mean by that? Obviously, he can't mean that form is the efficient cause of esse, because God is the cause of esse. So what does he mean by it? He means that a thing has esse or is subject to esse because of its form. What does the form do? It actualizes matter. Okay, you have prime matter, which receives a substantial form. Insofar as prime matter has substantial form, it is a fitting subject for existence. Prime matter can't exist in and of itself as prime matter because it's lacking in any actuality. So it has to have form in order to be a subject of existence. So a substance, a thing that exists, is a fitting subject for existence insofar as it has form. So form gives esse to the thing. So it's in virtue of a thing's form then that it has esse. Now, insofar as the form of the human body is the rational soul, the human being has its esse in virtue of that rational soul, which is an immaterial form. That then means that insofar as the form of the human substance doesn't perish with the perishing of the body, the active existence of that human substance doesn't cease with the cessation of the body. So the active existence of that individual substance, you or I or anything like that, remains. Okay, that doesn't mean that I myself remain, because I, will have lost something which is essential to me, which is my body. But it does mean that, my rational soul will remain. Gavin's rational soul, with all its individuating characteristics which it has acquired throughout my life, will remain. I won't be fully me because I won't have my body, but my soul will still remain. And then if miraculously it's reunited with its body, which, miraculously it will be through the resurrection, I then will be back, okay, fully myself, actually even more fully myself, because I'll be, sort of purged of all my sin and stuff like that. God willing, if I, I'm one who is saved, which I am hoping and, endeavoring to be, but, I'll be more fully myself insofar as I'll be resurrected. Now, that account of immortality and then into eternal life with the resurrection, you'll not find that in Aristotle. First of all, because you don't find the metaphysics of the active existence in Aristotle. So that argument that my rational soul with the active existence of me remaining, you'll just not get that in Aristotle. Aristotle has a little quip in De Anima, book 3. I forget the actual chapter, but it's something along the lines of if there's something eternal in man, it's the act of the agent intellect, that ability, that power by which we're able to understand things. So he just has that little quip there, and no more than that. So certainly you can say what Thomas says here is consistent with Aristotle. Okay, it requires an Aristotelian anthropology, but it goes beyond it. It develops it further. And then obviously it augments it, with revealed doctrine about the resurrection.
Mm.
How's that?
So basically, there's no there's no contradiction really there, is there, between Aristotle or Aquinas on their view that the soul. It's just that Aquinas takes it further than Aristotle.
Yeah. So an Aristotelian is free to reject Aquinas's account because Aquinas, sort of adds and modifies and consciously adapts Aristotle. But there is, as you say, there's no contradiction there. So an Aristotelian might just say, well, why do we have to go there? Show me the arguments here. And of course, Thomas being Thomas, will have those arguments and his defenders will give you those. But yeah, there's no contradiction between, Thomas and Aristotle here. But an Aristotelian is free to say, well, hold on a minute. I kind of need to have good reason for this.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. So that's the soul covered. I think we've covered everything there. There's probably more to be said, but
yeah, definitely. Yeah,
I think that'll suffice for now. And it might actually cover the next topic as well a bit. What we've just spoken about there. Because the next topic is being and essence.
Being and essence. Okay. St. Thomas wrote a little treatise with the title on being and essence. Whose Latin title was De Ente et Essentia. And that seems to have skyrocketed my career. So being an essence. So what do you want to know about being an essence then?
I'm trying to think if it was worded in any particular way. I think it might just be how Aristotle and Aquinas differ and how they view being an essence.
All right, okay, yeah. So we've kind of touched on this quite a bit. So okay, so the big division in the ancient world, well, it's not the only division, but the big division amongst the ancient Greek philosophers was between Plato and Aristotle. So Plato and Aristotle, they're reacting to the problem of the one and the many, which is a problem which is derived from the standoff between Heraclitus and Parmenides. Is reality essentially flux, which is the Heraclitean doctrine, or is it essentially unity, which is the Parmenidean doctrine? We want to affirm flux. There is something, at the heart of reality which does involve change. We don't want to say that change is merely illusory or incidental, but we also want to affirm unity. We don't want to say that unity is just, illusory or incidental or anything like that. So we want both. And always, whenever we have this standoff in philosophy, between two diametrically opposed positions, we get a development in the philosophical problematic. Whenever you get a third position, which affirms the truths contained in both, but gets away, from their inconsistencies. And that's what Plato and Aristotle give us over Heraclitus and Parmenides. Plato, first of all, because Plato was the first to recognize that being or reality is not univocal. It doesn't have a single characterization to it. It's not the case that it's either one or many. We can affirm that it's both. Being, is subject to a plurivocity of understandings. And this is what, the myth of the divided line is, in the Republic, that, reality is like the divided line, with the form of the good at the top, and then you have all the different forms, and then you have the objects which participate in the forms, and then the shadows which imitate the objects. The further down the line you go, the less and less real you get, and the more flux and multiplicity you get. The higher up the line, the closer towards the good that you get, the more and more reality you have, and the greater unity you have. Now, Aristotle, he rejected Plato's theory of forms. He didn't reject forms, but he rejected this idea of the separation of the forms. He affirmed that, yes, being is a plurivocal notion. There's a plurivocity of meanings to being, and he famously has this notion of the analogy of being. So if you take something like health, okay, and we can list all the sorts of things that are healthy, food, medicine, diet, bodily fluids, all of that we can say are healthy. But there's one thing missing here, that unless we have it, and unless we, have this as, as some sort of analogate of health, food, diet, bodily fluids, they wouldn't be considered healthy. And that's the subject of health. The animal, let's say, is the primary subject of health. And then a diet is healthy for the animal. Exercise is healthy for that animal. Medicine is healthy for that animal. So you take myself, for example, there's a certain diet, there's a certain exercise regime, there's certain, well, I don't take any medicines, but there's certain medicines which would be positively unhealthy for me if I took them. Okay, and there's a certain diet and certain exercise which would be positively unhealthy for others if they did, which would be healthy for me but would be unhealthy for others. Okay, think of a diabetic, or think of somebody with heart problems or whatever trying to do my exercise routine. It would not be very healthy for them. Okay, so you have a primary subject of health, and then you have secondary analogates of health. Well, Aristotle held that being is like that. You have a primary referent of being, and you have secondary reference of being. The primary referent of being is substance. Okay, substances are primarily what are, and then accidents, they only exist, or they're only designated as beings insofar as they designate some sort of modification of the substance. Okay, now, primary substance for Aristotle is the individual thing, and it is the individual thing it is for Aristotle because of its form. Now, the form for Aristotle informs prime matter. So you have a substance because you have some sort of form known as the substantial form, which informs the prime matter, and you have that material substance in front of you, and then you have the various accidental forms, which are the modifications of that substance. That was Aristotle's account of things. Now, neither Plato nor Aristotle recognized, or neither Plato nor Aristotle gave an answer to the one and the many. In terms of the existence of things. They only gave an answer to the one and many in terms of the form of things. It was form that ultimately explained the being of things, and then we articulated multiplicity by some sort of relationship to form. So you have multiple forms in Aristotle because they're received in matter. You have multiple forms, or you have multiplicity in Plato because you move further and further away from the form of the good. It's not until you get to Aquinas, influenced definitely by the Neoplatonists, but it's not until you get to Aquinas where you recognize a principle for the actual existence of things, which is the act of existence, which is esse. And in Aquinas, then, you get an articulation and an answer to the one and the many, not just in terms of form, and in this respect, he follows Aristotle to a certain extent. It's a modified Aristotelianism. So Aquinas does give an answer to the problem of the one and the many in terms of form, but he also gives an account of the one and the many in terms of existence. So it's both essence and existence then which are taken to account for the one and the many. And so Aquinas goes beyond Aristotle in accounting for the being of things by not limiting that account to form and how form informs matter, but also to explaining how the very existence of things are accounted for by means of the act of existence. And in this respect, he is closer to Plato because he sees existing things as participating in their respective acts of existence. So he uses Plato or Platonism to account for the one and the many in terms of the existence of things, and Aristotelianism to account for the one and the many in terms of the essence or the form of things.
Brilliant.
So, how is that? Is that okay?
I think that kind of covers, kind of overlaps into the next subject that we've got as well, because this next subject was going to be participation theories.
Yeah.
Which we've kind of touched on a bit there.
Yeah.
Of how Aquinas took the more Platonic theory.
Yeah.
So the question, as it was stated, or just not particularly a question, but just a statement, was, as I understand it, Aristotle helps concepts participating in other concepts, so genus and species. Aquinas, as I understand it, affirms a more Platonic theory of participation in his works.
Yeah.
So if we could just go over that a bit, get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So in the history of philosophy, so far as I know, Aquinas is the first to bring in a definition of participation, to give a definition of participation. There is no known author prior to Aquinas of which I am aware who has a definition of participation. You might have intimations of it, but there's no concrete definition. No, I mean, happy to be proved wrong on that, so all I'm saying is there's nobody of whom I'm aware that gives a definition of participation. Geiger, the French writer on Aquinas's metaphysics of participation, he says the same thing, that it's not until You get, sort of to Aquinas that you're getting this definition of participation. Plato used this notion of participation throughout his works. Notoriously, he didn't give a definition of what he meant by it, and this annoyed Aristotle. And in the first book of the Metaphysics, Aristotle says, look, the Pythagoreans talk about the imitation of numbers, the Platonists talk about participation. All they've really done is change the name. They haven't brought any enlightenment here. In commenting on that passage, Thomas, he agrees with Aristotle that the Platonist notion of forms is just incorrect, but he doesn't go with Aristotle in that sort of, real sort of snide and sarcastic critique of the Platonists. He actually takes a moment there to say, well, look, this is what the Platonists meant by participation. In reality, it probably wasn't what Plato meant by participation. Well, I can't say that. I can't say it probably wasn't, because, I'm sure, some sort of Platonist could come along and say, oh, here, well, what Thomas says here is actually consistent with Plato says here, here, and here. But when Thomas says this is what the Platonists meant by participation, he's not basing that off any sort of scholarly engagement with the works of Plato, because he knew very little of the works of Plato. What he's doing is saying, what he's actually doing is saying, well, look, here is an account of participation which is consistent with what I know about the Platonists, and which avoids Aristotle's criticisms here. So, obviously, Thomas is keen to preserve a notion of participation from Aristotle's attacks. Now, in his commentary on the De Hebdomadibus of Boethius, Thomas gives us a definition of what it means for one thing to participate in another. First of all, he gives a bit of an etymological definition, and he says to participate is for one thing to take a part of another, partem capere. Okay, so he does this sort of folk etymology here. I don't even think that that's correct. The partem capere is the etymology of participationem, but it's a bit of a folk etymology, and he's sort of just doing a play on words there. It means to take a part of something. What does that mean? It means to possess in a partial manner what is in itself universal. And there's three modes of participation. There's that first conceptual one, as a more universal concept is participated in by a less universal. So as a species participates in a genus, or the individual in the species. The second one then is a more ontological one, and it's as a subject participates in a form. So as matter participates in substantial form, or as the substance participates in accidental form. Notice in these cases, the form which is in itself universal is limited either by the matter which it informs. So my rational animality is limited to this chunk of matter. Okay, it's a limitation of the form. So the matter participates in the substantial form, or the substance participates in the accidental form. So my substance, me as a substance, I have a certain quantity. I am 6 foot tall. I'm currently about 77 kilos. So I'm participating in those accidental forms. My substance, really what all they are is they're modifications of my substance. Now, in themselves, they're universal. Any number of humans can be 6 foot tall and, 77 kilograms. But, in this instance, they're individual to me. So I'm participating in that substantial form, that accidental form, which is in itself universal, but limited to this instance. That's the second kind of participation. And then the third kind is as an effect participates in its cause. So the cause has greater power than its effect, because the cause has the actuality in which the effect participates, and the effect wouldn't have the actuality were it not for the cause. So the effect participates in the power of the cause, and that's the third type of participation that Thomas delineates. And it's that kind of participation which relates essence and esse, that esse participates in, essence participates in esse in order to be. That essence would not be were it not for esse. But notice something there. How are essence and esse related to each other? As potency and act. Essence stands in potency to esse as act. So not only does essence participate in esse, it stands to it as potency and act. It's composed with esse. Now, whose metaphysics had act and potency at its heart? It was Aristotle's. But Thomas now has taken that act potency metaphysics, applied it to his own account of essence and esse, and interpreted it in terms of participation. And he knows full well that he's doing that, because in his treatise, the De Substantis Separatis, when he's writing about Plato and Aristotle, he says, look, you know, the Platonists, they talk about participation. Aristotle talks about act and potency. Every participant which participates in some sort of, you know, participative perfection is subject to act and potency. So what Aristotle's saying and what Plato is saying here, with Aristotle with act and potency and Plato with participation, they're saying the same thing. Now, Thomas is really forcing the issue there. Okay, that only works with his metaphysics of essence and esse, but it just, you know, sort of shows you how he, you know, is keen to develop and modify, you know, these disparate thoughts taken from these philosophers to advance his own thinking on things. So that's just that's kind of just a brief sort of intro to, you know, sort of Thomas's, you know, vision there of participation and act and potency. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's a bit of a start anyway.
Yeah, I was just reading in your book this morning actually about how Aquinas was able to bring Aristotle and Plato together in the way of bringing the theory of Plato's theory of participation together with Aristotle's. I forgot what term used. Aristotle's theory of to go along with Plato's participation.
Was it act and potency?
I don't think it was, but we could call it that for now, just because it does fit still.
Or was it Aristotle's compositional metaphysics? Was that it?
Oh, it could be, yeah. Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll double check it though, but I think that sounds right.
Right. Okay.
So is there anything else that you'd like to add to that before we move on to the next subject?
Not that I can think of, other than the authorities for Aquinas' participation metaphysics are Cornelio Fabro and Louis Bertrand Geiger. Okay, it's a French name, but for the life of me, I don't know how a French person would pronounce the name Geiger, Geiger. You know, because French typically don't use the sharp G's. So if anybody in your audience, you know, wants to email me a phonetic pronunciation of that name, Geiger, I would love it, because I've been saying that name with a Belfast accent for the last 10 years or so. And even when I'm reading, you know, his name in French, I'm reading it with a Belfast accent. Yeah. So if we have any French speakers could, you know, give me a phonetic pronunciation of Geiger, I would be in your debt there. But they're the authorities on Aquinas' metaphysics of participation. So Louis Bertrand Geiger and Cornelio Fabro. I think poor Geiger had a bit of a tragic life towards the end, because he taught, I think it was in Belgium or Switzerland, and I know somebody who had classes with him back in the day, and I think he was in a car accident and it really affected him, and I don't think he really sort of did much philosophy after that. This is a story that I was told about him, you know, so if anybody in your audience, you know, is able to confirm that, but this is a story that somebody told to me about him. So God love him, he was in an accident, and you know, he just you know, philosophy, it just really affected him really badly. But in any case, both Geiger and Fabro, they are the authorities on Aquinas and participation. So they did those groundbreaking studies of Aquinas' metaphysics of participation around about the mid-20th century. Geiger's book and Fabro's book, let me just get the exact titles of it. You're going to hear a terrible French and Italian accents here, because see, I learned to read these languages and never learned to speak them, because I didn't have to speak them. So I just learned to read them. So Fabro, here we are, 1950. La nozione metafisica di partecipazione secondo San Tommaso di Aquino. Okay, so the metaphysical notion of participation according to St. Thomas of Aquinas, and that was in 1950. And that was followed up by Participazione Causality, selon St. Thomas de Aquin, and that was in 1961. So they're the two books by Fabro. And then Geiger's book is La Participazione dans la philosophie de St. Thomas de Aquin, and that's in 1942. by Geiger. Now, there was another book by Rudy Tevelde, who's still with us. I think he's in the Netherlands. And Tevelde's book is Participation and Substantiality in Aquinas. Great book. So I would recommend all three books for anybody interested in Aquinas' participation metaphysics. John Whipple's book, The Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas, has a chapter on participation where he draws all the different treatments, not only by Thomas, but also by Thomistic commentators together to give an account of participation, very closely related to distinction between essence and existence. And William Norris Clarke, in a little book of his, Explorations in Metaphysics, has several articles on Aquinas on participation. There was a book produced by an Irishman, an Irish Jesuit, called Arthur Little, and it was the Platonic heritage of Thomism. There's some problems, there's some issues with that book, so it has to be, read with, it has to be taken with some caution. And William Norris Clarke did a review of it for one of those neo-scholastic journals. It might have been the New Scholasticism or the Modern Schoolman, I'm not sure, but it's one of those neo-scholastic journals anyway. William Norris Clarke did a review of it. So it's a book, I'm sorry to say, because it's by an Irishman, but it's a book that, needs to be read with a bit of caution, because there's some issues with it. But that's another one, The Platonic Heritage of Thomism. So they're the sort of books, to have a look at if one's interested in Aquinas' participation metaphysics, and that kind of gets you into the Neoplatonic strands of Aquinas' thought, and it allows you to see Aquinas as an original thinker in and of himself.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying at this point for anyone who's interested in learning more about Thomas's metaphysical thought, that John Whipple's book is kind of a must-have, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Before Whipple's book, I suppose Joseph Owens would have been, one of the main sort of commentators. William Norris Clarke as well, Gilson. But with Whipple's book, The Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas, brought out in 2000, that's, that was a benchmark. Anything published on Aquinas' metaphysical thought afterwards has to take into account Whipple's work. And, obviously Whipple's work takes into account the big commentators as well, Owens, Gilson, all the rest. But because Whipple brings it all together in such a neat way, and in such a condensed and, historically accurate way, it really is the go-to book. If you want, not just an introduction, but a comprehensive treatment of Aquinas' metaphysics, you go to Whipple. And if it's not in Whipple, you're practically guaranteed that, there'll be pointers to where you can find it. Whipple will give you pointers to where you can find a treatment of it. So it really is the text to have.
Yeah. So that kind of brings us on to one of the last subjects that we've got here. There's one subject, and then there's one towards the end that we might speak about, maybe not so much as the others.
Yeah.
So the next one that we've got is natural desire for God. Obviously in Aristotle and Aquinas.
Yeah. Well, I know more about Aquinas on this than Aristotle. I really haven't, sort of thought too much about Aristotle on the natural desire for God. Other than that, the absolute unmoved mover, self-thinking thought of Metaphysics 12, sort of draws the motion of the first mover, which, sort of draws the motion of all the spheres, and thus, sort of draws, the motion of everything subject to the spheres. So in a very sort of a descended kind of way, things have this natural motion towards self-thinking thought, which is the best kind of life. But you don't really get a strong account in Aristotle, at least that I am aware of this being drawn towards some transcendent good. You do get the notion in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics that there is this desire for the good. The good is that which all desire, and that is that's found in the life of virtue. Living out the good life as the life of virtue. You do get that. But you certainly, so far as I'm aware, in Aristotle's thought, don't get this idea of being drawn towards some transcendent good to which every creature is directed. But you do get that in Aquinas' thought. Again, that's a Platonic notion, that all being is ultimately derives from the good and seeks to return to the good. You get intimations of that in Plato, and you definitely get that in the Neoplatonists. And that's something that you have in Aquinas' metaphysics of creation, because as we were talking earlier about per se ordered series, there's a primary cause of all that is, and that's pure esse itself. But then you flip the per se ordered series reasoning, and there is a primary final cause of all that is, which is the good itself. Now, insofar as pure esse itself acts for the sake of the good itself, but the good itself can't be anything distinct from pure esse itself, because then pure esse itself will be subject to the good. It would stand in potency to it. So pure esse itself has to be the good itself, on the basis of which it, does what it does. And so in choosing to create God, pure esse itself, the good itself, undertakes to create so that creatures can enjoy the good which God he himself is. Now, how can creatures enjoy the good which he himself is? Well, God as pure esse itself is that without which nothing could be brought to completion or perfection. Any actuality which would complete a creature is contained in God preeminently. So creatures, in desiring the good and seeking to be completed, are seeking their actuality, are seeking to be made actual in some sort of way. So they're seeking an actuality in which they are deficient. And all such actualities will be found in God himself. So all creatures then, in seeking to be made actual in some sort of respect in which they are deficient, are ultimately seeking what God is in himself. Now, that doesn't mean that all creatures are seeking God, because a cat isn't perfected in its being a cat by being united with God. A cat is perfected in, being a cat by, food and sleep and all the rest. And if, like me, you think cats are demonic, then, cats, will be fulfilled in some other sort of, demonic sort of way. I'm not a cat person, they're handy for keeping mice, Dogs, on the other hand, dogs, I'm definitely a doggy person. In any case, each creature is perfected as the kind of creature that it is. So a human being isn't perfected in the way that a monkey is perfected, for instance, or in the way that a dog is perfected. It has implications for the natural law. What it is for, a human being to, live the good life is not the same that it is for a dog or a cat to lead the good life. So the natural law isn't saying just because this happens in nature that these, animals do this, that, advocates of the natural law hold humans should be doing that. No, that's not what we're holding. Human beings have a nature, acting in accord with which then is what leads to the good life. That's what, sort of natural law holds. And it sort of ties in what we're talking about here, that for a human being to be complete, to be perfected, is to be perfected in a human kind of way. What sort of things are humans? Well, they're rational animals. Now, the completion, the actuality in which all creatures are deficient, the actuality in which a creature is deficient is contained ultimately in God, whose pure actuality itself, the good itself. Now, what could bring a human being to complete actuality? Remember, a human being is a rational animal, so it engages in nutrition, it engages in, sensory, sort of engagement with its environment, but it also seeks to know the truth and to will the good as a rational animal. So it stands in potency to all things intelligible, and it stands in potency with its will to willing the good. So only that which has the actuality can satisfy the human being, because that's, what it strives after in being a rational animal. But what has the actuality of all things intelligible? What is the good itself? It's pure esse itself. It's pure actuality itself. So all human beings desire God as their ultimate perfection. God is the ultimate perfection, of every human being. No human being can be made complete, can be made happy, without being united to God. So the destiny of every human being then, on Aquinas' account, is to be found in God. And this is where the really cool stuff, where that metaphysics of creation ties into Aquinas' commitment to a revealed doctrine, because whilst all of creation strives after God, to be united with God, something that even the pagan philosophers were aware of, there's something about human nature, especially in Plato's account, the myth of the cave, and the divided line and the simile of the sun. There's something about human nature of which we are aware that it strives after a good which is beyond itself, which it can never attain. Plato was well aware of that, in his colorful sort of parables. Aristotle was aware of that, and tried to explain how we can't, we're striving after the good, but we can't obtain it. And, that's moral weakness. That's the weakness of the will. They're aware of that phenomenological reality of failing to obtain the good itself. Christians are well aware of that. We call it sin. That's original sin, and that's the tragedy of sin. That we're striving after, God, which, will fulfill us in the way that we're, seek to be fulfilled. But we can't obtain God because of sin. There's this sort of discord in our nature. And so the uniqueness about, the Christian revelation was that the ancients thought God was lost. And we had to try and find God. And once we found God, that would be us complete. Whereas at Judaism and later Christianity, Christianity very explicitly, you find this in in Judaism, but you get it very explicitly, with Christ's self-identification, is that God isn't the one that's lost. God's fine where he is. God's happy where he is. He's not lost at all. We're the ones that abandoned God. We're lost. We're lost to our sin. We're lost in original sin. We turned away from God, and we're lost. And being in our sin, we realize that we pursue things that we think is the good, which isn't actually the good. And that's what sin is. It's the pursuit of something which which isn't actually our true good, but we pursue it anyway. It's not actually truly good for us. And so we've lost the true good. We've lost true north, and we're lost in our sin. So we can't find our way back to God. We've fallen from God's grace. We don't know what the good is, and when we do know what the good is, we don't do it anyway. So we've fallen out of God's grace, and we've lost true north, darkening of the intellect and weakening of the will. That's where Christ comes in, because Christ reveals God to us because he is God. Okay, he's the second person of the Trinity, the Word of God, through whom all things were made. So he, through whom all things were made, becomes one of the things that are made to reveal God to us. So, he reveals the true nature of God to us, and he restores us to a relationship to God, so we have access to the grace by which we are empowered to do the good that we know we should do and enjoy communal friendship with God. So all in all, what that Christian revelation then does is it gives to humanity what the pagan philosophers keenly felt was a lack, of the good that we're striving after. It gives that to us. It gives us the way to that good that the philosophers were striving after, but they couldn't find. So just as, in Plato's account, philosophy is a transforming experience, the prisoner that leaves the cave is transformed and can never go back to the cave. So one is transformed when one does philosophy. Philosophy disposes us then to accepting, that Christian revelation. And that was felt keenly by St. Thomas in his metaphysics of creation, because all creatures, human beings in particular, strive to be reunited with God, but realizing that we can't be reunited with God unless God makes the first move. And so whilst that doesn't necessitate that God has to become incarnate, because God, out of, gratuitous, decision becomes incarnate. He didn't have to, save us from our sin. That doesn't necessitate that God has to become incarnate. It is no surprise that God does become incarnate, because that's what everything points towards. So, one's intellect then in accepting, that metaphysics of creation, that philosophy, one then is predisposed. Okay, so the soil is the good soil now for the planting of the seeds of the gospel there. How does that sit?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that was all ad-libbed. I had at one point, I was going from one point to another there, and the final chapter of my creation book is on how, all of creation, strives to return to God, humans in particular. But then the stuff about Revelation and stuff, I thought I would just throw that in at the end there.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that your second book is another one that I'll have to add to my list as well.
All right, okay. Okay, good. Well, I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm enjoying your first book so far, Aquinas' Way to God.
All right, good.
Yeah, and I haven't even got to the proof yet. I'm still just finishing off the chapter on essay.
Oh, right. Right, that's the third chapter. That was the first three chapters on the metaphysics.
So we've just got one question left now on humility.
Yeah.
So we might not have as much to say on this topic as we have the other ones. But are there any differences that you can identify in Aristotle and Aquinas?
Yeah. So, God, there would be more differences that I could think of, on humility when it comes to Kant and Hume and, and sort of contemporary views of humility and Aquinas than Aristotle and Aquinas. But let's see what I can say about it. There is a view of humility which takes humility to be a denying of all the good things about us, a denying of ourselves. That's one view of humility that is certainly prevalent. That it means that we need to deny all our positive traits, and in doing so, we will be humble. And I think this was David Hume's view of what humility was and why he rejected it. He called it the monkish virtue. And in reaction to that, Kant wants to give a more, charitable account of humility, not to dismiss it as a monkish virtue whereby we have to play down all our good traits, but Kant sought to give a view of humility whereby it's just a sober evaluation of ourselves and our strengths and weaknesses. Now, that view of humility, it stands in contrast to what one could call the Christian view of humility, because on the Christian view of humility, it doesn't require us to reject all of our positive traits. And why is that? Well, because God is humble, Christ is humble, and he doesn't deny himself. So how could God and Christ be humble, and yet humility requires us? Humility on that sort of monkish virtue view requires us to deny all our good and positive traits. So what gives here? What is humility? Humility on the Christian view is a recognition that you're not the master of your life, that your life, in order to be, a truly fulfilling life, in order to be the good life, is a life that has to be ordered towards God as your final end. So only when you recognize that God is your true north, your final end, that in which, all your desires, all your wants, all that is of you will be fully complete, then you're humble. That's when you have humility. And that's the Christian view of humility. And that's how God can be humble. And that's how Christ can be humble. And that's how, Christians are taken to be humble. So obviously that has nothing to do with, denying all the good things about ourselves, the positive things about ourselves, such as, having a great family, having a great relationship, having an awesome beard, having, an education, writing books, publishing, doing podcasts. all these things, being a musician, you're a musician, aren't you?
Yeah.
All these things, being humble doesn't require denying any of that. What it requires is seeing all that is the ordering of a life towards God as the final end, because God, is the final end of one's life. Now, in Aristotle's thought, the good life is not the life which is perfected by becoming united to God as the final end. The good life is the life of virtue. Okay, primarily the four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And so the good life involves inculcating those four cardinal virtues, and in doing so, you lead a happy life. You lead a life of eudaimonia, and that's more or less true. You will lead a happy life. You will lead, the good life, if you inculcate those four cardinal virtues. But you won't be brought to complete. There'll always be something lacking there, because human nature can only be completed in God. Let's St. Augustine, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. And then Aquinas is more sort of, philosophical account that, the very being of things receives its completion and perfection in God, who is the good itself. And how are we united to God? Well, it's through the gifts of, it's through the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. The cardinal virtues predispose us, they make us like that good soil in the parable of the sower, to receiving faith, hope, and charity, which can be received only as graces, only through grace, as infused virtues. And then the cardinal virtues themselves are transformed. They are no longer natural, sort of habituated virtues, but they themselves are, infused by grace, so that the prudence is not just the prudence which is involved in living the good life here and now, but it's involved in living the good life by which we are disposed to become united to God, after we die. Same for justice, same for fortitude, same for temperance. Now, when it comes to fortitude and temperance, there are two virtues which are species of fortitude and temperance. Fortitude is the virtue by means of which we don't flee from obstacles. So we have the fortitude to overcome obstacles. Temperance is the virtue by means of which we control our desires to engage in that which delights us. Just as natural virtues, that's, say, overcoming an enemy or overcoming an obstacle, a mundane example, you have to get an essay or an article written. You kind of don't want to do that. You prefer just to sit and read or scroll Facebook instead. You see the essay as onerous, so fortitude kind of kicks in. Temperance also kicks in as well. You temper your desire to go and just scroll through Facebook. Fortitude kicks in. You overcome that kind of, I have to sort of do this. Okay, mundane examples. In the life of the Christian, with the infused virtues of faith, hope, and charity, and the infusion of grace into the cardinal virtues, whereby they're transformed and directing us towards God, fortitude is overcoming things which would turn us away from overcoming those obstacles, overcoming those fears, which would turn us away from living the good life by means of which we can be united with God. So not being afraid to, say, preach the truth, something like that, even if it means we're oppressed, perhaps even martyred for it. Temperance means not just avoiding, say, those things which delight us, let's say just naturally delight us, food and wine, for example, but also those things, whilst they may be licit, but which would also be, which would also kill off our spiritual lives. So we all have these things which can kind of, kill us in our spiritual lives, all these, various sins that we might have a temptation to. Now, fortitude and temperance have two virtues, which are species of them. Fortitude has the virtue of magnanimity. Okay, magnanimity is a species of fortitude, and magnanimity is a virtue by means of which we overcome the fear of doing things which are great, of doing great things. And there's a virtue which is a species of temperance, by means of which we kind of overcome the desire to do things which are beyond us. Okay, so magnanimity is the virtue by means of which we overcome the fear of doing great things, and temperance is the virtue by means of which we overcome the desire to do things which are a bit too beyond us. Okay. Humility is the virtue, a form of it's a species of temperance by means of which we overcome that desire to do things which are beyond us. Now, Aristotle would have recognized magnanimity as a virtue by means of which we show our greatness, by means of which we, exhibit our greatness. Now, Aristotle would have been happy enough with a virtue such as magnanimity, but I don't think he would have thought that humility is a virtue which would lead to our flourishing. This is because in order to be humble, in order for humility to be a species of temperance, we have to overcome the desire to do things which are beyond us. There are certain things which are beyond us, and we have to recognize that they are beyond us because we, are subject to original sin, and we are prone to sin. And so we need to be dependent on God in order to overcome that. It's only God who can save us from sin. And so fundamentally, unless we recognize that, we just cannot be disposed to receiving grace. Humility is the virtue, the having of which, through, infused grace, we can see ourselves as subject to sin and in need of God's grace. That wouldn't have figured in Aristotle's thinking because he didn't see the end of human life as being united with some transcendent good, such as God. Certainly his moral theory is consistent with the more expanded sort of Christian view with infused virtue, but it doesn't quite get us there. So whilst magnanimity would have figured in Aristotle's thought, I don't think humility would have. But it certainly figures in Aquinas' thinking because it's the virtue by means of which we overcome the desire to do things which are beyond us, i.e. to be our own saviors. So fundamentally, it allows us to, recognize our dependence on God for our salvation. Sorry, we didn't have too much to say about that, but that's how, just asking on that question of humility, that's how I would address it. That's how I would go about doing it. How does that sit with you?
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Kevin.
Okay.
There was also obviously a question that we haven't covered today because we don't know too much about the topic. It was the topic of war, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. About which, well, I mean, I know about war, but not in the philosophical or theological sense. Yeah, no, it's an area I haven't engaged in. The more I'm getting into moral theory, and the more I'm engaging with moral theory, the closer I'm coming to get more and more interested in war and views on war, and the ethics of just war and stuff like that. But yeah, it's just to my shame, it's something I haven't engaged with. So I'm sorry, I couldn't say anything intelligible. Or anything I could say about it would be even less intelligible than what I've been saying thus far. So
maybe a video for the future then.
Yeah, once I eventually engage with that material. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, brilliant. So we've managed to cover a lot today, and I'll see if I can make timestamps for these as well for people to find them easily if they've asked any of the questions we've covered today. So just before we finish, if you want to give just a quick summary of any upcoming work that you've got coming up, or any books that you're writing, or anything like that.
Yeah. So I will have a piece coming out on Aquinas on the Transcendentals. I think I'm still not allowed to, because I don't think I'm allowed to announce where it's coming out, but there is a piece forthcoming on Aquinas' thinking on the Transcendentals. There's a piece coming out in a special edition of Divinitas, so the journal Divinitas. They're doing a special edition on Aquinas and contemporary thought. And so I've got a piece coming out on Aquinas' metaphysics and existential inertia. So this whole existential inertia objection to arguments for the existence of God. I know that sort of Oppie in relation to Feezer, brought this up as an objection, and Joe Schmidt published a paper on the matter. And it's an issue which kind of came up now and again in recent thinking, but because it's got some prominence in the whole Feezer Oppie Schmidt debate, I thought I would do something to kind of just show how it doesn't affect Aquinas. So that's a paper which is coming up in Divinitas. Yeah, and there's another paper which is coming up. Again, I don't think I can say the publication that's coming in because it's in process. But this is on how Aquinas' way to God is a metaphysical way to God. That any proof for God's existence to be found in Aquinas, any proof of God which is Aquinas' way to God, is metaphysical. So that's some of the stuff that we were discussing earlier. So that's quite fresh in my head at the minute. Another paper I've got in submission is the lecture I gave for the Thomistic Institute conference at the Angelicum, which is up on YouTube. So so that was worked up into full length paper, all duly footnoted and scholarly. That's in submission, at least. Okay. And then there's that other paper that I was just telling you about. I was working on it today, of integrating formal and material causality into per se ordered series. So if I get this finished and that gets published, which I hope it will do, that means I will have given an account of per se ordered series, which involves efficient, final, formal, and material causality. So the four sort of different sort of causal lines, as it were, all within just one per se ordered series. And that'll kind of just allow me to explain the whole metaphysics of creation just by means of per se ordered series. Yeah. So that's, as I say, I got 5,000 words of that out today. And other than that, I'm continually working on this book on the resurrection. So at the minute, I'm looking at different accounts of faith, and in contrast with Aquinas' account of faith. So what faith is, what the act of faith is, what it involves. I really hope to get that finished. I keep having to stop and start it because a lot of all these other articles and just a lot of stuff with work, marking, lecturing, all that sort of stuff. As well as the sort of ever-present sort of being on lockdown and kind of not having your usual sort of rhythm for research and stuff. But anyway, I'm working on it. Words are getting added to it. Work is continuing, and I'm also re-engaging with an issue which was very prevalent in my doctoral work of the mind-world relationship. I published a paper several years ago on John McDowell and Aquinas, and it relates to my doctoral work on Kant and Aquinas. So I've returned to these issues, and I'm thinking about them once again, and I think I'm going to sit down and write something on the issue of just whether or not in Aquinas the content of experience is the content of knowledge, because on classical empiricism the content of experience isn't the content of knowledge, that the mind has to go to work on the content of experience to make it knowable. So I'm thinking of addressing that issue, because there's some convergences at least between Kant and Aquinas there, because for Kant the content of an intuition is the content of an act of understanding, but then obviously for Kant it's it's in the transcendental deduction from the Critique. We impose the categories on the content of an intuition, but nevertheless that idea that there's homogeneity of content between intuition and understanding is something that I think can be found in Aquinas, that there's homogeneity of content between experience and knowledge. So it's something that I think I might address soon. So that's what I'm working on anyway.
Wow, there's a lot of stuff to keep his eye out for there, isn't there?
It's just this is what we do. There's nothing else to do.
Yeah, have you found that? I mean, you were just talking about your routine in lockdown there, weren't you? Are you finding more time to write, or is it kind of counterintuitive that you're finding less time to write during this time?
Yeah, when you're at home and you can't go out on campus and you don't have your daily routine, you think, oh, being stuck at home all day, it'll be great. I'll get so much research done. I'll get so much writing done. But insofar as you don't have that routine where you go out to class at 9, you teach to 11, you've got 2 hours between 11 and lunch at 1 o'clock. You've got lunch 1 to 2, and then you've got an afternoon. Having that routine, you think, right, I'll do writing between 11 and 1. I'll have lunch. I'll come back after lunch. I'll do reading for an hour. I'll do admin, for an hour. I'll do, sort of student emails for another hour. I'll get more writing done in the early evening. When you have a routine where you have to go out and do things, it in a sense makes you more prone to, fit your research and your writing in. Whereas when you're not going out and doing things and you're stuck at home all day, you kind of just think, oh, well, I'll just sit down with this book and, read this book. And 4 hours later, you're still reading. And whilst reading is an integral part of research, sometimes you can do so much reading and say to yourself, I'm researching, but, you've got through about 4 or 5 books and, you've got through so many pages and so many articles and you haven't actually taken pen to paper and written anything. And you kind of have to catch yourself on after a few weeks of doing that and think, oh God, I actually have to, start writing something and start getting some content out there. So ironically, I find during lockdown being, just stuck in the house all day and, maybe only getting out for a walk with a dog for about an hour, that the research does kind of fall behind unless I make a conscious effort to, ensure that I do some research. But the upside of lockdown and being stuck in the house all day is that, I've really upped my numbers with regard to my coffee drinking, whereas before, I would only sort of catch a coffee, when I had the chance. Now, because I'm not going out to classes and I'm not going to have my coffee maker with me, I've almost doubled my coffee intake, so I'm really proud of that. The numbers have gone up and no more rookie numbers with coffee, I think I'm at master's level with the coffee drinking now. So there we are.
Yeah, it's very easy for the hours to drift by, isn't it, in lockdown?
Yeah. And one day just merges into the other and into the other. If you don't set a routine and something that you have doing every day, I mean, you just get lost, Which for an academic, well, at least for me as an academic, I kind of really need a structured kind of approach to, reading, research and all of that.
I was thinking earlier on today, is it Friday today?
Right.
Okay. For those people watching, it's actually Monday today.
Yeah, it's Monday.
Right, excellent. So we've managed to get through all those questions here that were asked on the different Facebook groups that this video is specifically for, but obviously it will still be public for everyone to see. So just to finish up then, a huge thank you again for coming on and just giving us your time to answer these questions.
Not
Very
a problem.
Much appreciated.
Yeah.
Perhaps we could do this at another point in the future, comparing Aquinas to someone else, as long as they're not a living philosopher, though.
Because I don't like that. I don't like kind of naming living philosophers, and unless it's a publication that I'm referring to, but I don't like to kind of talk about living philosophers in a confrontational sort of way, at least not on podcasts, It's just, I like them to be there, if they engage in a conversation with them rather than, talk about them, unless I'm referring to a publication or something or a general state of the debate sort of thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, just a thing of mine. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll just draw it to a close there, I think. So thank you for everyone for watching. Thank you to Gaven again for his time. And I'll see you on the next video.
Thank you.